Here's a question. Anyone heard of Faker? Do you know any SK Telecom fans? Well, those over 30 won't have the slightest clue what I'm talking about. I'm talking about some of the most famous players of League of Legends. League of Legends, also known as LOL due to its initials, is one of the most successful video games in the world. You heard that right. Many may think that video games are simply a domestic form of entertainment. We buy the game, we play it at home, alone or with our friends, and that's pretty much it, right? Well, dear viewer, nothing could be further from the truth.
Blizzard will open its first US eSports stadium in Los Angeles next month.
Yep, that is really something that's happening. Nowadays, video games have become a mass sport, almost on the same level as football or Formula 1. To give you an idea, only in 2017, eSports, that is electronic sports, moved more than $1.5 billion through sponsorships, merchandising, and investments. Yeah, now that is still a little compared to the $8 billion that Formula 1 moves, for example, but it isn't bad if we consider that this new mass sport isn't even 10 years old.
To give you an idea, the first League of Legends World Championship was held in 2011 and had an audience of about 200,000 spectators. 7 years later, in 2016, more than 14 million people from around the world saw the final match. These figures are only a little bit lower than the ones we could find for an NBA final, but not much lower.
Now, League of Legends broadcasts even have their own commentators in various languages. And where do you think esports are the most popular? Of course, that would be in Asia, in countries like China or South Korea. They account for more than 60% of video games audience. Unlike Formula 1, which never really took hold in this part of the world, esports have really stuck. And logically, this has led to an uproar in the investors' world.
Intel, HP announced record investment in esports industry.
However, the internet and new technologies have always been the perfect breeding ground for generating financial bubbles that explode in a rather big way. We've all heard about the dot-com crisis at the beginning of the 21st century, or the downturn companies like Snapchat took. So the question is, are we really talking about a new sport, or is this simply just another bubble? Can a mass sport simply be created from nothing just by investing money? Well, we're going to answer these questions in today's video, but first, let's take a look at the history.
Who invented Formula 1?
In 2015, a group of investors called Liberty Media bought Formula 1. You might be wondering, well, how can someone buy a sport? Well, the truth is that Formula 1, in addition to being a sports competition, is also actually a company. After the Second World War, with the car's democratization, a massive public emerged who loved seeing the fastest cars in the world. And car manufacturers, they were happy to participate in these races. Competitions gave them the perfect excuse to test their latest engines. To give you an idea of this, a Formula 1 car can cost millions of dollars, even though it's never intended for the consumer market. However, the technology it uses ends up being implemented in utilitarian cars. For example, disc brakes or active suspension were innovations born in Formula 1. Throughout these years, the only entity in charge of regulating and dictating the competition rules was the International Automobile Federation, also known as the IAF. However, the real business didn't emerge until the 70s, when this guy came along. This is Bernie Ecclestone, something of the Ayatollah of speed. Ecclestone was the owner of a Formula 1 team. He immediately realized that this sport was a money-making machine. But the business was neither in the prizes nor in the car companies. The real money was in selling TV transmission rights around the world. And what do you think Bernie did here? Well, he partnered with the other teams, went to the IAF headquarters, and told them, either you give us transmission rights so that we can manage them, or we stop running and you're out of races. And that is how what we know today as the Formula One Group was born. That is, it's a sport that became a company that is even listed on the New York Stock Exchange. In other words, on the one hand, we have the IAF, which is in charge of organizing the races and creating the regulations so that everyone competes on equal terms. But on the other hand, the one who really has all the money is the Formula One Group. And we're not just talking about a few dollars here. In 2011, they made a profit of over $1.5 billion. And when we talk about billions of dollars, it's easy to get lost in the figures and not really know how much that is worth. But put it this way, the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, could be built with that kind of money. Now, as you can imagine, these two organizations, they're often fighting and they do have a lot of legal conflicts. So, well, now you might be wondering, well, how does Formula One make any money? Now, pay attention here, because this is going to help us analyze esports better in a moment. Most of the money comes from transmission rights and from the payments that municipalities and different governments make to host any of the races in their cities. Those two things alone account for 60% of the income. The rest is made with company sponsorships, that is, advertising and merchandise sales. And so, in other words, the too long didn't read version is, yes, a company can create a big sport and make billions of dollars from it, from essentially nothing. Now, the question is, can esports replicate this business model? Well, let's dive into that right now.
From pixels to legends.
Just like car racing video game competitions are as old as video games themselves, the first major tournament was held in 1972 at Stanford University. More than 10,000 people gathered to see the best Space War players. Space War was one of these old video games with big pixels and 8-bit music. In those years, video games hardly had multiplayer systems and internet connections barely existed at all. In other words, in those times it was very hard to organize any competition that was really worth seeing.
So, just as interest in Formula One came about when most people started having cars, interest in esports came when most people started having high-speed internet connections.
And you might be able to guess the first country where competitions were held. Yep, it was South Korea. In 2006, South Korea was the country with the fastest internet on the planet. And at that time, half of the population had broadband connections. In other words, this was the perfect breeding ground for the first big Halo or StarCraft players to emerge. And so, how did these players become famous? Well, that's through streaming platforms such as YouTube, or above all, Twitch.tv. And that is essentially how esports fever broke out in South Korea.
Seoul's getting a new dedicated esports stadium come March 2016.
Now you may be wondering, who would be the Bernie Ecclestone of esports? And, well, that answer is Riot Games. This is the company that created the most successful game of all time, League of Legends, which was released in 2009. We're talking about a video game that seems to have been made for competitions. I mean, check this out. To that time, online games were, a bit rudimentary. Of course, there were titles like World of Warcraft, which had fantastic graphics and a great story, but these were role-playing games, which one can play for hours and never win and never lose. Also, you have to pay a monthly fee to play, and not everyone can afford that.
However, League of Legends is free, has great graphics, and an unbeatable game mode, and games last for about an hour. They have a winning and a losing team. In a very short time, this video game gained millions of players around the world. And since they were connected by the internet, the teams that were created were completely international.
For example, one of the best-known groups, known as Origin, has Spanish, French, and Finnish players. The truth is that by the year 2011, they had a critical mass of users. And to celebrate it, they went to an industry festival that was being held in Sweden. They had an audience, and they played to celebrate the championship. Allowing their players to share their screens on YouTube or Twitch was enough to offer a show on an international scale. And as we always say at VisualPolitik, as it was said, so it was done.
Season 1 championship reaches 900,000 viewers.
One thing was clear. There was an audience who wanted to watch matches from their favorite game on their computer screens. From the initial 900,000 spectators, we now have surpassed more than 14 million. And the players, who are now professionals, travel around the world on athlete visas. This means that from the institutional point of view, League of Legends is now considered a rightful sport. And where there's an audience, there are also companies willing to pay for publicity. Don't forget, we're talking about video games here, a perfect environment to sell computers, graphics cards, screens, or even high-speed internet connections. In other words, every technology company has recently decided to sponsor eSport events. And as you can imagine, that's where the gains come from, as there are also huge investors willing to invest in this industry.
Zacks investment research highlights 3 esports stocks to watch.
It's clear esports are a business that is growing by leaps and bounds, but how far can it go? Could we be talking about the new Formula One? Well, if you remember, we mentioned that most of Formula One's income comes from the rights sold to TV networks. But for now, esports are broadcast openly, freely, through online streaming platforms. Therefore, there doesn't seem to be a big television business here. And on the other hand, so far, no governments or municipalities have seemed willing to pay to host a tournament. In other words, Formula One has a diversified business with different income streams, which means that even in times of crisis, the company continues to make an income. However, at the moment it seems that the bulk of esports income depends largely on their sponsors. And by definition, sponsor-based businesses are unstable. But above all, the biggest problem with this type of sports is variety. There's only one Formula One, there's only one football, but there are lots of esports, and we don't know which ones will last and which ones won't. League of Legends has achieved an undeniable amount of success, but it was created in 2009. I mean, will it still be fashionable in another 10 years, or will a new electronic sport emerge that will pick up the baton? Make no mistake, esports, they're here to stay. The question is, which one is worth investing in the long run? Of course, these are all reasonable doubts for any new industry, and under no circumstances do we want to underestimate this phenomenon. But as we always say at VisualPolitik, not everything is as it seems, and the devil, well, it's in the details. And having said that, I'll leave you with this question. Would you invest in an esports company right now? Do you think we're facing a new mass sport that will generate billions of dollars? Well, leave your answer in the comments below. And if you want to know more about another emerging economic industry, in this case that of electric cars, we tell you about that in this other video where we look at the competition between Tesla and BMW. Also, if you liked this video, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, I'd like to thank our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.